Now, I should just explain one thing, which is this is such a huge topic, right? Because there's two bits to this. There was Karl Marx, a Satanist, and then there's the other bit towards the critical diabology, comparative diabology, which is the study of comparative views about the nature of the devil across different faith systems and belief systems, kind of interfaith thing. Now, if I was still teaching at Birkbeck, I would have done a whole course on that subject and got in each week, like a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, got them to talk about the devil and their faith. But unfortunately, I've only got one class, you see, so I'm going to have to do the whole thing in just the one evening. But bear in mind, it's a really big topic. And for that reason, you see, I was invited at the University of Oxford last night to do a talk. So this is like part 2 of a 2-part talk. And I covered quite a lot of ground last night. And I'm going to cover the second part this evening. But I'm going to repeat some of what I covered there. Yeah.
Shaheen managed to record the first part?
It was recorded last night. It wasn't Shaheen, it was yeah, we recorded it, and so both...
Is it possible to focus on Marx tonight? Because I don't have enough film to go.
Well, don't worry about filming me. I'm recording it, and you're recording the sound. That's the key thing. And I've got, a sequence of things I'm going to work through. Marx is at the centre of it, but I'm going to cover the wider question of comparative diabology as well. Would it be sensible? Do you want to keep the door open for airflow? Is that the idea? Okay, fine, good. Right. Okay, I'm going to start with asking the question: what would a comparative diabology look like? Now, I've just had lunch with Professor of Religious Studies at Oxford University, who's an expert in interfaith research and Hinduism, in fact, East Indian religions. And I asked if anyone had asked this question of comparative diabology anywhere in the field of interfaith, interreligious studies. He said no, basically. So this is pioneering stuff. Why is it important to ask that question? Well, I would have thought it's obvious. You have to open the news, and people are slaughtering each other in different parts of the world in the name of a kind of religiosity that invokes the notion that the other people are the devil. Okay, so we're living in a world in 21st century when conspiracy theories become kind of mainstream. And the Jewish Masonic Illuminati conspiracy running the world, Mossad did 9/11, and so I'm a suicide bomber, I'm going to get back at them because, they're the bad guys. Alternatively, I might be living in a world where, actually it was the Saudi Arabians that did 9/11 in conspiracy with Bush, and the really dangerous guys are the Muslims, and so I'm going to get back at them, and I'm going to bomb them from the air, because they're the devil, And look, they burn people in cages, and they do beheadings. So obviously they're satanic. Or I might live in a kind of double mirror world where, no, actually, Mossad are running ISIS and funding them in order to pretend that the Muslims are the devil, so then we can justify bombing them and invading Syria. So it's like spies versus spies. A kind of conspiracy mirror theory thing. All I know is that they're all accusing the other guys of being satanically inspired. And as a peace studies scholar, that's why I'm here, I'm saying we need to actually look at this critically and ask what on earth is really going on here. When I was teaching here back in the 90s, I don't think there were many religious extremists who took the devil literally enough to start blowing each other up. Things have deteriorated. And so I'm saying we need to ask these questions. And that's why it's, I think, an important topic. What would a comparative diabology be like then? Well, it would examine the archetypal history of the devil idea in comparative, religion and comparative philosophy. Because different philosophers have written about the devil. It's very interesting. Calvin and Augustine and Aquinas, mainstream Christian thinkers have had a lot to say about the devil. In the course of the 17th, 18th century, they came to the conclusion that the devil notion was no longer sustainable in advanced theological circles in Europe, particularly in Protestant Europe. And people like Lord Herbert of Cherbury and early Enlightenment thinkers decided that the idea of eternal punishment wasn't sustainable ethically. You can't have a devil ruling hell, inflicting eternal punishment on people just for a few mistakes they make in one lifetime. It doesn't compute. So they kind of grew out of that notion of the devil. And that's partly what we mean by the Enlightenment. By the time you get to Rousseau and Voltaire and Jeremy Bentham, who founded, this complex university college, and, the enlightened thinkers of that time, the notion of an actual literal devil was something that was a bit passé, and it was a hindrance to ethical advancement of mankind. But unfortunately, the Enlightenment has kicked in at different parts of the world at different stages. So at exactly the same time as the European Enlightenment was going on, you had Ibn Wahhab in Saudi Arabia declaring jihad against anybody that wasn't a hardline Sunni, and writing books against how everyone else who wasn't a hardline Sunni was actually inspired by the devil. That includes all the other Muslims, Shias, Ismailis, Sufis. They're all of the devil. But as for Christians and Jews, well, they're satanically inspired. So Ibn Wahhab unfortunately taught, the Saudi young little dynasty of sheikhs into backing him militarily. And wherever he went and conquered parts of Saudi Arabia, what became Saudi Arabia, he destroyed the graves because worshipping and paying respect to the dead is forbidden in a very strict Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. And also even went as far as to cut down groves of trees that were liked by, there were sort of mystical Sufi type things. The tree is sacred, therefore we can say our prayers under it. No, they've all got to go. And so, but it was all based on a very literal view of the devil. Ibn Wahhab, the complete opposite to Bentham and the Enlightenment thinkers. And that's really the prehistory of what we've got on the planet at the moment. So if we're going to do a comparative diabology, we have to engage with a critical study of enlightened thought as to why they outgrew the literal notion of the devil. And then we have to look at people on the planet that haven't outgrown it. Okay. And by the way, quite a lot of Christian thinkers have not, they still take it literally. I brought along a few exhibits here. One is a very interesting article. Every year in Rome, in the Catholic clergy, they train 200 priests a year in the rite of exorcism. You can volunteer for this from any parish in the world, and you're taught how to exorcise people. In 1975, what used to be the Roman Inquisition's Center for the Propagation of Faith published a study called Christian Faith and Demonology, which was making clear that the devil is a real living force. And the current Pope, Francis, went on the record to say that there is a struggle between God and the devil, and that you can't just, you've got to realize this is a living force. The devil is not to be forgotten or softened into a metaphor. Certainly, can I ask you to sit somewhere else apart from here? This is my little. There's other things at the back. Here is fine. Yeah. Okay. So there are groups taking the devil notion literally. Still, obviously, quite a lot. And then there are others who've thought critically and philosophically. So they need to be studied comparatively. And we've got to revisit the enlightened thinkers. Was Bentham wrong? Maybe the devil is a reality, and maybe we've got to uninvent the Enlightenment. Maybe we should rethink that. If anyone's got definite proof and evidence the devil's alive and kicking as a real being, then true philosopher's going to re-examine the evidence and come up with the facts. I think one thing we could do, though, is look at the history of witchcraft trials. The devil used to be a judicial reality, and people who didn't like each other would accuse the other guy of being inspired by the devil. And if you could show that he made the milk sour, and your babies have got fever and died, then there's a chance you could get him hung or burned or whatever. And we know about the Salem witchcraft trials, when hysterical groups of girls were accusing different people of working with the devil and so on. So, and it was partly a reaction against that misuse of the devil notion in law that led to the Enlightenment. Profound jurists and legal thinkers began to think this is ridiculous, because actually, it'd be a nightmare if we brought that back onto the statute book now, because half of Britain would be accusing, in Scotland, the Scottish nationalists would all be accusing the Unionists of being devil worshippers and vice versa. It would be a political thing. It was also used in the Inquisition, judicially, and torture was applied to extract confessions. And unfortunately, in Saudi Arabia, there's a department of witch finding under law. In Saudi Arabia, if you're accused of witchcraft and they get you, you can be, I believe, beheaded. You can certainly have serious problems, imprisonment and so on. And sorry? They beheaded 4 so far.
No. To my knowledge, at least 4.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. What I read is just having this thing of a candle burning. If you sit at home and you meditate, burn incense and light a candle, that's enough to get done for witchcraft in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, correct. So that's a problem. But admitting to being a Satanist in Saudi Arabia is definitely a no-no. You'd be beheaded immediately. So anyway, if we were going to do a comparative diabology, it involves the field of law, comparative law studies. I just came up from Oxford on a train with a lawyer, and we were discussing, comparative law and so on. We've got the Institute of Comparative Law around the corner here in Russell Square. I wonder if they probably have some arcane books on the history of witchcraft in international law, because it's still on the statute book in some countries. In parts of Africa, you probably know there are these witch camps where women usually have been accused of witchcraft in local villages, and they've nowhere to go because they get exiled. The minimum punishment is you get thrown out of the village, excommunicated. And so they congregate, don't know where to go, no way of living. And there are like tens of thousands of these so-called witches have congregated in witch camps, and the international community doesn't know what to do with them. I mean, as far as we know, they're all totally innocent. They were just strong kind of people who maybe looked at you in a strange way, and they've ended up being homeless and stateless and just persecuted. So it's still going on in parts of the world here. Yeah.
In parts of Africa, it's actually witchcraft is illegal.
Sure.
On the statute book.
Yeah. That's.
Not only that, it's usually single women who are accused of witchcraft.
Right. Well, this is exactly what it used to be like here in Britain.
In South Africa, for instance, they do what's called necrocing, which basically means they throw
a burning tyre.
No, basically put tyres over them, fill the tyres with petrol and set them alight.
Right. No, I'm aware of that punishment. I mean, obviously, so it's quite a serious subject we're talking about here, and I hope that the judicial authorities in these respective countries, especially Commonwealth countries, might consider reviewing their statutes. And this is why I think Bentham was on to the right thing when he called for constitutionalism and rational law. Okay, so if we're going to have some kind of agreement, let's imagine the chief imams of Saudi Arabia were hearing this talk and the top Shias of Iran and stuff. Well, I'm going to say that we need a new enlightenment that extends the original ethical insights of the European Enlightenment, but now it's global, and it can draw on the insights of all the different faiths as well, because the European Enlightenment by and large didn't really factor in Islamic thought in depth. It didn't know much about it. But I think we now need a global enlightenment in which we can revise and review this. And I take Kant's dictum, sapere aude. We have a duty to be wise. We have to have courage to do that. So that's the spirit in which I'm proposing this notion of comparative diabology. And I'm going to argue that Marx can be sort of slotted into this. His project, which was part of that enlightened heritage, is actually, relevant and overlaps with this. I'm also going to argue that the history of actual witchcraft, I've gone into it in quite a lot of detail. I used to work with a chap who ran an MA course at Birkbeck on the history of witchcraft. He's Britain's leading specialist. I'm not sure if he's even still alive. He was doing brilliant classes here back in the 80s and 90s. Most witches were just country people who had certain gifts, second sight, clairvoyance, healing, normal kind of spiritual abilities. And because the level of education wasn't very great, so they put it down to satanic influence. I think hopefully we're a bit more aware that there are people who have these skills, sensitives, but it doesn't mean they're diabolically possessed. As long as they kind of stay on the straight and narrow. Queen Elizabeth I, who's one of my heroines, had quite an intelligent way of dealing with witchcraft on the statute books, because when she came to power it was unlegal. So she said she wanted to change the rules a bit, it wasn't illegal to be a witch, to have those kind of powers. It was a magical time in Britain in the Elizabethan Renaissance. Shakespeare was writing Midsummer Night's Dream. It was fine to be a white witch. Actually, that was very good, to do healing and use your powers for the benefit of the realm, right? What she said, being a witch isn't itself punishable. It's not a bad thing. It's misusing your skills to do harm to others. So using your witchcraft abilities to kill, murder, or maim other people. Now that is illegal, and that should be punished. Now that's a very subtle and important distinction, okay? And I think Elizabeth, she was actually excommunicated by the Pope, and the bull that excommunicated her is a horrendous, vehement attack against her for being a woman, for being, and basically authorizing anybody, if they find her, to kill her and do her in, because she's evil. So when the Armada set sail for Britain, it was carrying torture equipment on it, because, we were a land of heretics and all of the rack. But Elizabeth won that particular fight. Okay, so the next question we have to look at is, okay, that's witchcraft and so on, but what about actual Satanists? If we're going to do a comparative diabology, and we're going to ask in a minute if Marx was a Satanist, well, what do we mean by that? A Satanist. What do we mean by that? What is a Satanist, right? Are there such things? Okay, so look, I've done this periodic table of the world's religions, which I'm going to be referring to during the course of this. It's on a website. It's based on Mendelev's idea of the periodic table of the elements. They're colour grouped. So the green are the primal pagan religions. The light blue are the Christianities. This is humanism, so things like agnosticism. Marxism is in there, next door to atheism. Then you've got Buddhist, which are the red ones. Judaism, different varieties down here. New religious movements are here, and then philosophies, Kantianism, etc. here.
Which ones are the
yellow
noble ones?
Which ones are the what?
Noble ones.
Well, that's a very witty question, like the noble gases. I'm not doing an ethical audit on them. The fact that you're on the table doesn't mean I necessarily approve of your right to be there. It's a statement of academic fact that you exist as a path. So logical positivism is on here, for instance. Doesn't mean I approve of logical positivism. On the contrary, it's a turgid and ridiculous idea. And I was a victim of it at Bristol University. But it was influential, and Ayer and people dominated British academic philosophy, so they're on there, Anyway, look, so Satanism, number 106. Now, it's in the category of new religious movement. Now, you might cavil at that. And you might say, no, it's a very ancient religion. And some Satanists would probably say that. But actually, to be honest, things like this Anton LaVey, the Satanic Bible, and Crowley, and the revival of sort of obscure Golden Dawn Thelema traditions, it's a new religious movement. It's classified as such in objective study of religious studies. And so, now there are practicing Satanists, and there's a very small number of them around the planet, and I estimate there's probably about 10,000 on the planet alive and kicking at the moment, who, if I did a head count and said, what's your faith, they'd stand up and say, I'm a Satanist. By and large, there's two varieties. Some are theistic Satanists who believe in an actual sort of deity figure called Satan that they worship and invoke in ritual and prayer. Then there's a kind of atheist version of Satanism that says, no, Satan is simply an energy that lives inside us all, and it's the counterforce to the tyrannical God energy, which is the sort of the overseer, the controller of the universe, but who's always saying you can't do stuff, thou shalt not, seems to be the main code. Satanists tend to be hedonists. It was a big thing in California in the 60s. It really kick-started with the Summer of Love and the hippie movement, and most of those 10,000 Satanists will be influenced by that. Now, very few of them are what we'd call really nasty and evil type Satanists. Now, there probably have been a few of those, like Manson, who were doing quite violent stuff and human sacrifice type things and perverse sexuality, and there's a scare in Britain in the social services community a while ago that there was a satanic cult operating in Britain behind the scenes. There's now the paedophiles have been accused in Parliament and high levels. So, is there a satanic cult operating at very high levels in British society? the jury's out, but it's very interesting to watch what's going on. And then we can also extend the notion of a satanic cult, not so much as, we're not going to see an MP standing up in Parliament and saying, yeah, I'm an MP, but I'm also a Satanist, and yes, I torture babies. I don't think we've got any actual paid-up members of the Satanic Club in Parliament. What we might have are people that are so drunk on power and the misuse of power that they don't care about how many people they damage to get there. They lie, they cheat, they steal, and they sell their souls, as we've seen in the Dispatches series. Two MPs that, most people thought were reasonable, weren't sharks, turn out to be just on the tout, with all due respect. So, how many others? I'm talking about Jack Straw and the Scottish chap, Rifkin, yeah. But like I say, I think maybe there's another way of using the word Satanist, or someone so drunk on power and its misuse. And so there's all this stuff about were certain houses being misused for sexual shenanigans by MPs back in the 70s, 80s, and people are coming up as witnesses now. I think it needs examining, and we have to get to the bottom of this, and the truth should out, and finally they've got a commission of inquiry going. But I don't think, as I said, I don't think there's actual, signed-up Satanists as such. Most of the Satanists, I've met one or two of them, they're really sort of cuddly, nice people, actually, who just take a view that, they want to make a theological statement against a tyrannical deity position. Okay, but there are others. There's another very interesting chap I just want to draw your attention to, an Italian. The Italians are always quite clever people. This chap was called Giovanni Papini, lived from 1881 to 1956, and he was an Italian philosopher and librarian and polymath, studied and taught Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche, and studied Schopenhauer, and he also wrote, interestingly enough, an important precursor of what I'm talking about. He wrote a book called The Devil, Notes for a Future Diabology. Now, Papini was someone who, if Marx was on the left, Papini was on the right. He was a friend of Mussolini, and he became a fascist in Italian intellectual circles, and he believed that Mussolini was a good thing. He was stamping out on all the bad things to do with Italian society. And there is a tradition in the fascist community of sort of that kind of diabolic interest in Satanism. Julius Evola, another Italian fascist intellectual, was arguing the same thing. And there's a sort of right-wing occultism that was underlying what Hitler was doing with the Nazi movement and the fascist community. Now that's another kind of diabolical interest that they had. And their anti-Semitism, the reason they were persecuting the Jews, was because they thought the Jews were themselves satanic. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was the tract they all read, says that the Jews are a satanic race. Not only did they kill Christ, but they've been ruining the world behind the scenes ever since. And they deserve to be, stopped, blocked, and wiped out. Yeah.
Compliment what you're saying.
Okay.
Marx, there's a track with the Ramsgate. I don't know, his daughter lived in it. So he walked from Ramsgate to Canterbury, which took him all day.
Karl Marx?
Yeah, Professor David McMillan told me that.
Okay, on a pilgrimage?
Well,
sort of.
atheist pilgrimage, yes.
Okay.
And he hated the religious Jews so much, not the genetic Jews, the religious Jews, that is in the British Library under the racist section of Karl Marx. He said, Ramsgate is full of Jews and fleas, quote unquote. That's how much he hated them. Okay.
But he didn't say religious Jews and fleas. Well, he said just Jews and fleas.
Full of Jews and fleas. He meant the religious Jews because...
that's your assertion. I need proof.
Unless he was a self-hating Jew.
Now, we're coming to that. Definitely self-hatred is at the bottom of a lot of that. Yeah. Okay. Do come and have a seat here. Okay. By and large, can I just say, what would be lovely is if you save questions for the end, by and large, because I'm going to lose my thread and I've got quite a lot of material to get through. Okay. Yes. I need to sit with this stuff unencumbered. If you
maybe push it a bit here.
okay, can you move up a bit? You're fine there. That's fine there. Yeah.
Madam, you have to sit
Yes.
next to me.
There you
This is
go.
our custom, Thomas.
Here, have a
That
seat.
the
Paul,
lady
isn't
has
it?
to- Yes.
Yes. Greetings. Welcome. You're late. If you don't mind my saying so. Can you sit down and stop disrupting the class?
All right, forgive me.
Okay.
I sit here.
No. I'm trying to keep this clear.
I can't keep away from her.
You have to, just for 5 minutes.
I'm not going to. I'm going home.
Have a seat. Okay, could you sit down? We're in the middle of the class, okay?
I beg your pardon.
Right.
I beg your pardon. All right.
Okay, folks. Trying to get some order here is a bit difficult. I might have to stand up for a bit. Okay, so as I was saying, the study of comparative diabology is very deep and very exhausting, with many details. One of them is that right-wing and fascist tradition associated with Papini and Evola and co. and the Nazi tradition. There is perhaps, as I'm going to argue in a minute when I look at Marx, also a left-wing equivalent. But let me get there slowly in my own time. Okay, another question that we have to ask about diabology, and this is where our psychiatrists and psychologists might be interested, is the study of religious experiences, which is a new and interesting field of scientific study overlap with things like neuroscience and out-of-body experience and near-death experience. You know, it's an interesting field. Most near-death experiences that I've read reports of are beneficent. People go through a tunnel of light, they come out into some sort of heavenly world, meet their ancient grannies, and everything's sweetness and light. There is a subset of the study of religious experiences which aren't sweetness and light. There are one or two people who've reported near-death experiences which are actually quite unpleasant. I've met one or two of these people, but it's a small subcategory, but it's very interesting. And if we're going to study, diabology and what's going on here, we should be aware that those reports of negative near-death experiences are worth studying. There's also the wonderful. Now, I don't know if it's something you can research in your own time, but apparently there's a claim that when Voltaire was dying on his deathbed, he used to live in a castle in exile near Geneva, and he befriended the local Jesuit who used to come around and play chess often, which is great. I want to write a play about Voltaire's last days with the Jesuit playing chess and reviewing his life. Anyway, as he was dying, he's on his deathbed, and he screams out in mortal terror, saying, "The devil's coming for me!" Okay. Now, we don't know if that's true, if that's just the Jesuit made it up. Sorry?
Voltaire built a church with his own money.
Yes.
For his sin.
In Geneva, in that part of the world.
It said from Voltaire to God, and it's still there.
Well, Voltaire absolutely was a deist. He believed in God. But whether, anyway, I'm just saying, was he having a terrible experience during his death? That's something that can be studied. And then there's another field. No, could you save it to the end? We're doing questions at the end. Shaheen was being very naughty by interrupting them.
Tell him off.
Write it down.
Tell him off.
And we're having questions at the end.
The topic is we are talking about God existence or not.
No, we're not talking about that. I think you've come to the wrong lecture. Let me just give you the title here. Okay. There we are. Okay, so
you always misinform me, honestly.
That's the title.
There you go.
Okay, so the next topic I want to raise is Zoroastrianism and the notion of one of the descriptions of the devil is Ahriman or Angramenu. The devil, according to Zoroastrianism, the war between God and the devil, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, has been going on before this planet was created.
Thank you.
It's a very ancient cosmic battle. And the story, in a nutshell, for those that don't know, is that this planet and humanity were created as the locus for that battle. We're the testing zone where the forces of darkness and the forces of light are going to have it out, right? We, mankind, were created by Ahura Mazda to be the helpers in that struggle. We're like the hobbits, if you want, in the Lord of the Rings epic struggle. And the Dark Lords are fighting, Gandalf and the good ones. And we little hobbits have got bound up in it, and we have to help the good ones. But some of us are tempted, and we stray over and help the bad one. And that's, the official Zoroastrian story. Now, what's interesting about that is it predates this planet. So one variant of diabological theory that's prevalent, particularly on the internet, is to do, it's a crossover with ufology, the study of life on other worlds and UFOs. And there's a theory out there that, and which I actually had an interesting conversation with an astrophysicist at University College here recently, who's studying exobiology. If the universe is teeming with life, it's not necessarily the case that all of it is benevolent. Some may be malevolent. And if you read kind of channelers that contact extraterrestrial intelligences, some are beneficent, some are benevolent and working for mankind's advancement. Some are very negative and working for our destruction. And, it's a whole subfield. You could do like an MA course in ufology, conspiracy theories, and the struggle of good and evil. I'm just saying it is part of comparative diabology. And I would suspend judgment, but one theory is that man was actually seeded, we human beings on this planet were seeded by extraterrestrial intelligences for purposes that we don't know. If you've seen that movie Prometheus, that kind of terrain, it's very much of the now, which would actually fit in with Zoroastrian cosmology, which is very interesting. We humans have been given free choice, but maybe not enough data to really go on to make always to make the right choice. And then there's the whole question about abduction and evil aliens, So just hold that in your mind that might be part of this subject. And I saw some people involved with NASA and the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, are saying actually we don't want to send out any messages because the wrong kinds might answer. There's a debate going on in SETI circles. Should we broadcast signals? At the moment we're just trying to pick them up. They're saying, should we send a signal? But other people are saying, no, don't, because you never know what we might hear from. Okay, so another field that we need to look at is the whole question of esotericism. There's a centre at the University of Exeter for esoteric studies, which is founded by a colleague of mine, Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who's died recently, and who did a PhD in the occult background of Nazism, a very clever and intelligent man. And there's a centre for the study of esotericism in Exeter. So the subset of religious views that then look at the devil and how they look at the devil, what conception they have, that's part of this comparative diabology thing. For example, Theosophy, which some of you may know was founded by Blavatsky and is based in Adyar, the world headquarters in India. I've just visited the library there. Blavatsky writes about Lucifer or Satan in her writings, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled. The theosophical view on the devil is that the devil isn't a nasty, negative, evil force, but a kind of tester. And actually that's more in harmony with Judaism. Judaism officially, if I'm sitting up here giving this talk as a rabbi, the Jewish faith doesn't actually believe in a devil as such. There's nothing to link the story in Genesis, the serpent, with Satan. It's a tester, that serpent story. And it's about, can we bear knowledge? Can we bear responsibility for our actions? It's a teaching story. It's not about Satan. And I'm talking about biblical text here. Yeah, precisely. So Blavatsky felt that the devil had a bad press over the years, and that it was part of mankind's duty to evolve to a higher level of knowledge. The motto of the Theosophical Society is there is no religion higher than truth. So, both God and the devil for her were kind of theistic projections of a state of being, a state of awareness. Diabolical states, and she worked as a psychic with people with possession and bad experiences. Save the questions for the end, Shaheen, please. You're setting a very bad example. I'm coming to that in a minute. Okay. Okay. No, he can't anymore. I'm clamping down here.
You tell him not to interfere with intellectual.
Okay. So then we've got the Theosophical Tradition, and we've got offshoots of that, Neo-Theosophical. People like Alice Bailey, again, there's references to this phenomenon, very interesting. And then we've got the breakaway sect of anthroposophists, under Rudolf Steiner, who broke away from the Theosophical mainstream in Germany. It's tragically mistimed at 1913, just before World War I broke out. And Steiner had some very interesting things to say about the devil. He thought there was basically this figure, Ahriman, who was a mechanical force. He saw the mechanization of human society with horror, and he argued that machines were going to take over the world. That's Ahrimanic consciousness, and the reason they're dangerous is because they don't have souls. Machines. We humans have an immortal soul, which is our intellectual soul, and that is our unique and extraordinary gift. Right? If we become dependent on machines, we are selling our souls literally to Ahriman. Now, the machines can be very clever, and it's very interesting. He died as early as the 1920s, long before robots, computers, or anything kicked in. But he foresaw it, and that gradually human beings would sell out their spiritual freedom to this negative archetype of robot intelligence. Okay. Now, if you think about it, if this world self-destructs in our lifetimes with some accidental third world nuclear war, my castle's for the chop in Scotland, because I'm opposite the mountain where Britain's nuclear weapons are stored, Faslane, right? It's a goner. And so's London. And it will be machines that launch that, possibly accidentally. You know, we live on a knife's edge of survival, actually courtesy of the machines, which are now doing all the advanced warfare, drones and so on. Also international finance is all done by machines now. So, you know, Steiner maybe was quite a prophet in his own way. It's worth studying his views on the devil. He also thought there was a luciferic force, which is, again, misapplied intelligence. It's intelligence which is so highly developed that it becomes unethical. And for Steiner and for most philosophers worth their salt, you have to balance wisdom and intelligence with ethics and goodness.
Thank you.
It's better to be a good person than a very clever person, okay? But it's better to be, I mean, Buddhists talk about it, you have to combine prajna, which is wisdom, with upaya, which is skillful means, which is knowing what to share when, etc. So anyway, Freemasonry, Goethe and some of the great Freemasons also wrote about or in their literature or whatever, in Goethe's Faust. He was fascinated by the devil. I think Freemasonry would take the view, and if you study esoteric Freemasonry, that Satan and the devil represent an initiatory test that we have to pass through. It's a stage of, confrontation, which we need to transcend through remembering our true humanity. That's what gets us through the magic password. And if you look at Mozart's Magic Flute, which is a Masonic-inspired piece, that's what that is all about. Is how you get through, the chaos and redeem from evil through love. It's the same with Goethe's take on Faust. He eventually defeats the devil through pure love. Another source we can look to is the Yazidi teachings, if we're doing comparative esoteric studies on the devil. Yazidis who've been persecuted a lot by ISIS. It's an archetypal clash of great tragedy, actually, because I don't know if you know, but the Yazidis are a very ancient Middle Eastern religious tradition, predating Islam. They're much more Zoroastrian in their views. They believe they have a text which is older than the Quran, and their view of the Quran is that it's a later misinterpretation of the real story of what happened at the fall of man. The official Islamic view is that Iblis, which is the Islamic name for the devil, when ordered by Allah, God, the Creator, who just created mankind, to bow down and worship mankind as his latest creation, and all the other angels bowed down and said, "Oh, you're great, Allah, this is great, your creation, he's great," and they all bowed down. Iblis stood back and said, "You've got to be joking, Allah. Why should I worship that little worm? He only lives about 70 years. Most of it's miserable existence. He's not very intelligent. He can hardly walk. Has got a very small vocabulary. Doesn't know what to do with his life. He's always mucking up his emotional life. Why should I worship that? I'm 100,000 light years tall cosmic angel. I helped you create this entire universe. So of course I'm not going to bow down. What I'll do is just help him along a bit." And Allah then sent all the other angels out had a private chat with Iblis and said, Iblis, you alone have answered correctly. Of course you shouldn't have bowed down. It was a test. That lot all failed. They're just toadies, yes men. You alone had the intelligence to know what the correct answer was. So I'm going to put you in charge of the education of this new little creature. And you've got to bring him on and teach him basic ethics, right? And right from wrong. And that's the Yazidi take on the Garden of Eden story. And on the whole, and so when Muhammad comes on, brings the Quran saying we're going to smash Iblis and we're going to, declare war on Satan, the Yazidis are saying it's totally the wrong approach. They haven't got a clue what they're talking about, because we know the more ancient wisdom. And that's why there's this tremendous battle going on. That's why the Yazidis all had to go and hide in the mountains. But what I'm saying is time to call a truce, and let's all sit down together and do comparative diabology. ISIS can send their volunteers, Yazidis can come, Zoroastrians can come, Christians can come, and we can all engage in comparative mutual enlightenment experiences. Okay, the other source we can go for is Sufi and Gnostic Islam, the Ismaili tradition. I've just been to the home of Konya, where Rumi's tomb is. Rumi, the great Sufi, had a different take on this, much more in tune with the Yazidis. Satan is there to tempt us, and actually for us to prove that we're bigger than falling into that error, And also Haji Bektash, who's also buried in Cappadocia, great founder of the Bektashi order of Sufis in Turkey. These are incredibly powerful Gnostic teachers who were much more mature than this infantile, anti-Satanic ISIS type carry-on. And within the Shia tradition as well, you have tremendously profound thinkers in Shiism who understood these things and were on a different league, really. Surawadi and many other great Persian Shia teachers. We'd also have to look at, the devil in all the other religions. Now, I don't have time to do it. Like I said, it's a whole course in its own right. But look at the periodic table. And if you click on the website, you get the names of God and so on in all the different traditions that come up. Okay, my next point, very important point, is about education. Comparative diabology has implications for education and scholarship. I used to work at the Institute of Education. We used to train teachers. We train religious studies teachers. I'm a trained religious studies teacher. And for centuries now, the different faiths have all been training their imams and priests and rabbis and so on. But the mistake they've been making is that, especially mission-type training, was training yourself in your own faith, Christian or Muslim or whatever it is, and then going out there and converting the other people because they're with the devil. So, if I'm sent to Africa, I'll convert the native Africans because they're all devil worshippers, or the American Indians. If I'm trained in Rome, I'm a Jesuit, I'll go and convert them, they're devil worshippers. And if I'm an Islamic missioner, I'm sent to Europe, I'm going to convert those devilish Westerners because they're all satanic and their women are all loose and blah, blah, blah. So the problem is, at the moment, the theology behind education of religion is you study your own faith in order to conquer the other people because they're with the devil. Right? And that's, I keep meaning to write to ISIS and suggest we set up a university together in the Islamic State. I'd quite like to be put in charge of religious studies. And I assure you, they'd probably sack me after the first day because I wouldn't, I'd change that view. Right? What I'm saying, the revolution that comparative diabology says, is that what we should be doing is conquering our own devils. If we start with the view that the devil is a psychological error, that, people who get very depressed, very, wicked, angry, aggressive, violent, etc., they can't master their... So we have to conquer our own devils and then help other people conquer theirs. And instead of going out to aggressively missionize, other people, we should be sitting down together and doing comparative diabology, helping each other to conquer our own devils, which is a whole different slant for education and religious education. So instead of, we need to study what is this force inside human beings that makes us turn to do evil acts. And instead of projecting it onto another, other religion and saying, well, it's all their fault, it's the Jews, they're devil worshippers, let's get them which is what people did in the Nazi era. We say, no, it's actually, that some of that in me. If Hitler had gone to this class and studied comparative diabology, we wouldn't have had the Holocaust, And so I think it's quite important that we do that. Okay. What else? Where else can we look for help on comparative diabology? I think we have to look at gender studies, and I'm sure Birkbeck won't be upset if I raise that topic here, because after all, Eve was a woman, and there's a very interesting clue in this story. There are some feminists today who've revived the Lilith story, Adam's first wife, and would argue that it was Eve's right to experience knowledge, that she chose the apple, it was a very wise thing. There's something in that old teaching story about women, and women are quite crafty and intelligent, and men have trouble with that. I'm sorry, these are huge generalizations, and forgive me, but there's also something about sexual experience here, because that's what kicks in after the apple experience. So it could be that whole Genesis myth is a kind of teaching coded story about women have often encouraged men to have those kind of experiences, and they bring knowledge. We all know that sexuality brings incredible knowledge. It's painful, it's difficult, it's messy, but who would do without it? It's a necessary experience we have to go through.
Sorry.
Okay, so Lilith is part of this story, and the spiritual feminists, therefore, have tried to reclaim this notion of the devil as a hero. Well, I was going to say that there's a tradition of feminist Marxism. Yeah, I'm coming to that, Jane. Just be patient. Because, yes, there's a tradition of feminist Marxism that is from this same tradition, that talks about women having been oppressed for millennia, made to do the difficult jobs, never getting paid, never getting rewards, never getting kudos, Well, so too the underclasses. Marx's point was that the poor have been repressed to the margins of history. They're the unemployed, the lowest paid workers and so on, the refugees. And so, in a sense, the feminists and the Marxists did an alliance together. Very early on, in Russian history, for instance, in the 19th century, most early Marxists were also some kind of feminists. You had very strong women leaders who saw Marx as an ally in the fight for women's emancipation in Russia. And they saw that, yes, capitalism oppresses and dehumanizes and alienates, but so does patriarchy. There's a link between the two. There's a problem, of course, with violence, and I had a very interesting awakening last year. I went to the International Peace Research Association conference in Turkey, and I was talking to a Palestinian woman, very intelligent, PhD, intellectual. She'd given a talk in a seminar that I was talking at, and afterwards she was sitting outside with her laptop watching pictures of a Palestinian terrorist chap with a bandana around his head and a Kalashnikov, posing like a kind of death cult thing. And she was saying, look at this, Thomas, isn't he sexy? Okay. And I thought, what? And she said, no, all the Palestinian women, this is their hero. We're all in love with this guy, because he is the great fighter who is standing up for our cause. He has the power, the bravado to take on the system, and that's why he's standing there with his gun. And there's something about the attraction of the revolutionary. And I think this is partly the success of ISIS. This is why all these British innocent little girls are going off to marry them. The heroic fighter who will stand up against oppression, in the name of the revolution, attracts that feminine adulation. And that is a problem for female psychology to work out. Why do women like violent men and support them? Why were the early Bolsheviks, never in short supply for a nice party? I think there's an attraction of women for Satan at the end of the day. That satanic, violent rebel figure is actually quite attractive, and maybe we should talk to Eve about why she, went for that in the beginning. I think, you could argue anthropologically it's about survival, and so survival requires, a strong male, so I go for the sexy terrorist because he's going to protect my people, etc. I don't know. Over to the women. And also the rock stars. I don't like heavy metal. A lot of these rock stars are into satanic stuff, if you listen to the lyrics. And a very aggressive, shouting type thing. But everybody loves them, flocks to them and listens. There's an entrancement going on here, which needs deconstructing and analysing, and psychoanalyzing. I've talked a bit about sexual abuse and power and the misuse of sexuality. This obviously goes on in our society, and not just in this country, but worldwide. And I think what we find so abhorrent about paedophilia is the misuse of power. I know as a teacher, children in your care. I call myself a paedophobe. They're scary monsters, children. I can't think of, finding them sexually attractive, but some people do. And I can only imagine it's because they then have power over them. And there's a problem of the misuse of power that's connected with that. It's interesting that Satan himself as a character, if you read Milton and Satan in literature, literary studies are part of this, Satan's actually quite powerless. He's the one cast out of heaven. He's the one marginalized. He doesn't have much of a good press or a good following. So is it, I don't know, is it that the overcompensation is that then one needs to build a false power through violence over people? That's the image of the vampire, the Dracula image who kind of sells his soul to Satan. Which again is very popular. Kids love the vampire novels and movies. Why? Is it, psychologically, is that the shadow, as Jung would say, that we've put in the margins, and therefore, in a sense, want to come back into our family? There's also reports of some misguided children doing satanic rituals. Kids. I know that when I was teaching religious studies in the schools, there'd always be one at the back when I'm teaching the Gospel of St. John saying, I don't believe in any of this nonsense, I'm a Satanist. Kids love to shock, and most of it's fairly harmless, and it's like kids' stories about witches and things. But no, some of it's surreal. Killers of James Bulger. There are some children that become quite violent and nasty, and I think you need to be you need to challenge. I would always challenge the kid that says it's Satanist and say, well, okay, fine, but it's a very hard path to walk. Do you know the whole story? And then we'd have very interesting conversations. There is also a prehistory of what I would call the diabolic misuse of sexuality and violence. As a peace scholar, one of the worst things that mankind ever did, I think, was combine violence and sexuality. One is eros, life force. The other is thanatos, killing. Where they're connected defeats me, right? But it goes back a long way. And I was reading a very shocking book about the history of the Roman emperors recently, Caligula and Nero. We're up to unbelievable, what we could only call satanic sexual orgies and misuse. Their idea of a good night, and I'm not killing, I can give you the references, sorry, not kidding, Freudian slip, was they would have normally homoerotic sex with a bunch of slaves, 4, 5, 6 in a night, and then they'd kill them in various gruesome ways. They'd torture them to death, right? And this was standard practice for Caligula and Nero, and a whole raft of these Roman emperors. Now, if you've seen I, Claudius, he touches on a bit of that, but the reality was far, far worse. But it's been censored. This is not taught in Roman history lessons. It's not taught in classical studies. But believe me, it went on. It was horrendous, okay? And it was exactly the combination of sexual perversion, as in, sort of unbelievable promiscuity, but also with violence. So rape doesn't do justice to what they got up to. It was abuse leading to death, and that's exactly what Satanists are supposed to do, right? So I think the Roman emperors, there's a good claim that some of them, again, drunk with power, the abuse of power. Now it's interesting, the only people that were standing up to them at the time were the early Christians, who'd had their leader crucified, again, in a typical Roman torture session. The Romans loved crucifixions because it brought them all kinds of exciting, fantasies. And then they were torturing all the other Christians. But the Christians knew what the Roman emperors were up to. And if you read the book of Revelations, you read the Christian scriptures, they're exposing and confronting them. The other group that were doing the same were the Druids in Wales and Britain. And that's why the Romans invaded these islands in 43 AD under Claudius. And if you think of what was done to Boadicea, again, it was sexual violence. Her daughters were raped in front of her. And that's what made her very angry. So the Druids were also standing up against the Romans. The Jews did as well.
For evidence, the Druids did really practice human sacrifice, just like the Vikings, just like the rest of them.
Okay, so I'll put that down as a question for the end, Shaheen. Thank you for that. That's a very good question. Yeah, no, we'll come back to that. Okay, so another field, if we're going to do comparative diabology seriously, another field we need to look at is this wonderful new field of consciousness studies. I've just been visiting this new centre that they've got here at Birkbeck on the brain. And there's a huge amount of funding now going into brain research. Consciousness is the great unknown of philosophy and psychology. What happens when consciousness goes wrong? When you experience states of very negative consciousness, extreme fear, and states that we would call like possession. Is there a psychopathology of consciousness? What is normal consciousness, and then what is not normal? Now, if you go on many mental hospital wards and talk to the patients, get to know them, they will come back to some kind of possession or diabolic experience. What's going on there? Voice hearers often will hear diabolic things. The devil told me to do it. Where does that come from? Why is consciousness so flimsy that it seems to be loose-wired and it comes up with those kind of experiences? So brain research and the study of consciousness has to be part of this comparative diabology. So too does the study of love, I would argue. It's very interesting, there's a new Centre for Sexology here in London, Institute of Sexology, handing out leaflets if you come into this building, if you've got one. Sexology needs to be complemented by the study of love.
Can I have the number?
I'll pass it round, yeah. Because again, it seems to me that mere eroticism, mere sexuality without love is the problem of what we're talking about here. The Satanist indulges in ritual sex magic, like Crowley and so on, for personal power. But they do so, they misuse the other party, and often Crowley's partners went crazy. It was a misuse of that energy. Sex is a very potent force, but I think it has to be combined with true love, and it's such a sacred force that therefore it needs to be anchored in a spiritual and psychological bonding as well as a physical bonding. I'm not sure so much about this trend for sadomasochism in our society. 50 Shades of Grey. Is that normal? Question mark. Is a society where sadomasochism has been accepted as normal? I'm beginning to feel a bit strange because I don't practice it and I'm not attracted to it. Am I the abnormal one? I don't think so. I think there's a dangerous slide. If you do the gentle sadomasochism, you end up, in the dungeon, and you can do the dangerous stuff, and that's the kind of satanic thing. So why is it that our society is becoming so attracted to that? I don't know. I ask that question of those who can research this. And then another question that comes in that: does the devil himself know how to love? It seems to me the devil doesn't do love, and that's what's unique about the devil. That's the tragedy of the devil. That's why Iblis is sitting away in hell, but actually waiting for redemption. There's a lovely story that when Christ, in the 3 days before the resurrection, he harrowed hell. He went to try and get the devil back, because even the devil is capable of redemption. But obviously the message hasn't got out yet. It's interesting, in Plato's thought, Eros is a daimon. Eros is a dangerous thing because Eros can link us to the heaven worlds and the earthly worlds. For Greeks, demons were spelt daimons. They were not negative. They were divine blessings, but you have to handle them with care. And I would agree with Plato on that one. The Symposium is a brilliant text for the study of authentic levels of eros and love. Another field we need to look at is emotions, the scientific study of emotions, which is a new branch of psychology. Extreme hysteria seems to be associated with devil phenomena. If you think of the devils of Loudun, the outbreaks, or at Salem, the outbreaks of devil possession are connected with sort of hysterical emotional chaos. What goes on, it seems to be contagious. And the madness of possession seems to have this emotional breakdown. If you think about what Boko Haram are doing in Nigeria at the moment, they're regarding all Western education as satanically inspired, and therefore it has to be fought on the battlefield. And that's why they're capturing these young women and forcibly marrying them off. But they're doing it in a sort of hysterical way, without thinking. It's an unbelievable, it's like a possession in itself that's swept over northern Nigeria. And I mentioned the African witch camps. I think what's going on here is a desire for purification. People are afraid of evil. People are afraid of the devil. And so we invent these religions to kind of put them in a box, codify them, stick a bottle label on it, and then, we've done with that, finished, right? And if it pops up again, we kill it. We get into heavy violence. And that's a version of the myth of redemptive violence. If you've not come across that, it's a very interesting interface between religious studies and violence. Some people think that the way to get free of violence is to do a lot of it, and that will redeem mankind. The way to defeat Satan is to kill those people because they're evil. But I don't think we can afford to go down that route anymore. We've got so many dangerous weapons of mass destruction on this planet. There's so many of us. We have to stop and pause and rethink and reboot the whole mental system that's constructed that fantasy, and transcend and heal our fear. Okay, which maybe just literally goes back to a primeval fear of the night, fear of the dark, fear of the wild animals. It's very deep in children. They've all got night terrors. Okay, so we also have to look at cognitive studies, because, as I've said, the devil is associated with superintelligence, but without morality and without goodness. Society is very interested in intelligence, and everybody's learning to be a super whiz kid programmer and make lots of money. But what are we actually using these machines for? To make weapons of mass destruction, to make surveillance techniques that we can all spy on each other and we can work for governments and, But actually, where's our morality in that? I think we need, and this is what leads to the conspiracy theories. The CIA are working for the devil ultimately, or MI6 or whatever. Nobody knows who to trust anymore. Everybody's incredibly intelligent, but nobody knows who's telling the truth. And so I think we have a problem there. And it's our sacred task, if you want, to bring about healing between these fractured superintelligences. And that involves healing between emotion and knowledge and reason. Okay. I'm going to sort of come to the central question now, the next question. Having gone into all that, those are just some of the areas of comparative diabology. There's a few others up my sleeve I'll leave to the end, okay? I now want to address the question, well, given all that, was Karl Marx a Satanist? Okay, so now I did write a book about this some years ago, towards the history of the interrelations of Marxism and esotericism. And I went into it in great detail as a research project. What I discovered, which is, I think, very interesting, is Marx was part of and connected to a whole underground movement in the 19th century of what you could call romantic occultists and revolutionaries. In those days, there was a sense that the old religious establishment of the official churches had actually become oppressive of people. It had become a spokesman for class distinction and and the keeping of the rich, and forget about the poor, you know. So in the late 18th century, at the time of the French Revolution and the American Revolution to some extent, the notion got out that in order to advance human society, you had actually to apply a rational analysis to society. You had to invent this thing they called social science or sociology. And figures like Saint-Simon, who was one of the founders of this tradition, argued that we needed a whole new spiritual awareness in society to advance human progress. So whereas conventional Christianity gives people symbolic liberation, you know, you get the Mass, you get the bread and the wine, the symbolic body and blood of God, what people actually need is the reality. And so we need to totally transform society so that there's more actual Christianity in our interrelations amongst each other. That's what he called the new Christianity. This is Saint-Simon, the French Enlightenment thinker who inspired Marx to some extent. And there was a number of others. The Romantic movement, you see, was, as you probably know from Shelley studies, was quite a revolutionary idea that God is not up there. God is an energy within here, which we share. We need a society that reflects that. That was the esoteric meaning of socialism. You know, we are a society. That is our communalism, if you want. Now, it's very interesting. The first man in Britain who called himself a communist, who was actually before Marx came along, even. The word communist was in use among these romantic occultist revolutionary circles in France and Britain. The first man who called himself a communist was a man called Goodwin Barmby. Now, Goodwin Barmby wrote a book. He was a Unitarian minister, so he was a spiritual man. And he wrote a book called The Reconciliation of God and the Devil. He was a very fast-thinking man. He thought, look, the rich use God to justify what they do. You know, the poor with their sort of forgotten, marginalised, you know, witchy groups, they're all in little covens on Dartmoor. They don't know what they're doing. So we've got to reconcile the whole lot and have a communist society in which we can all live happily. God and the devil can be reconciled. It was visionary stuff. William Blake was saying exactly the same. Typical romantic. He was saying that this notion of God, he was inspired by Swedenborg, who was into the study of spiritual experience. Yes, you know, people in the afterlife have God and devil experiences, but actually it's just projections, mental projections. What we should be doing is reconciling with love the fact of our you know, human materiality, which is our ability to have sensual experience, is not evil, Blake said. You know, touch and tenderness and sexuality are wonderful, blissful things. And so, yes, we need to reconcile God and the devil. And surely, in Blake's view, that's what Christ was all about. Actually, after all. Thank you very much. And there is a tradition in Rosicrucian Christianity that Christ, there's a saying, Christus verus Luciferus. Christ was the true light bringer. So that what Christ was doing was reenacting this myth of Prometheus, or Lucifer, who brings light for mankind, and then is crucified by his father, Zeus, angry god. You know, how dare you give mankind too much knowledge? But then triumphs over it. So that's a psychological kind of Jungian take on Christ and Prometheus, which I think Blake foresaw. Anyway, other people that Marx was moving in the circles of, very interesting. Lots of Freemasonic groups and esoteric groups. Now, the trouble is, of course, that, you know, in the thought world of post-protocols of Zion, Freemasonry is by definition a bad force. But what you have to realize is that in the Nazi thought world and in the fascist thought world, Freemasonry was associated with devil worshippers and Jews. Okay, so it was part of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the 1920s, going back to the 1890s when the protocols were forged, to argue that, yes, the Jews were a satanic force, they were doing ritual sacrifice of Christians, they were draining the blood off babies to, you know, use them in their nefarious rituals and stuff. This was all medieval anti-Semitism. But it got recycled, and Freemasons were lumped in with the same crowd. Now, if you actually study historically the actual historical origins of Freemasonry, as I've done over many years, and you talk to Freemasons, you go to their libraries. I purposely never joined the Freemasons because I want a free academic voice. I don't want to take the oath of my tongue will be torn out if I speak about them. So I refuse to do that. But I have studied their writings, and I know quite a lot about the history of it. And what they were was basically a kind of mystical sect of esoteric Christians, by and large, who were going for the elevation of human knowledge. Okay, the great lodge of the Freemasons in Paris is called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters. The Nine Sisters are the Nine Muses. Sorry?
Which Voltaire became a member.
Voltaire was a member, so was Jeremy Bentham, him up at UCL, but many other great scientists. The Lavoisier, discoverer of oxygen, and Joseph Priestley, who helped him on that, and Quenet, the founder of modern economics. It was called the UNESCO of the 18th century by a historian, Nicholas Hans, who was professor of education at the Institute of Education. And the top floor of the library there is his private library. This guy, Nicholas Hans, was a genius. He was a Russian historian of education who escaped from the Bolsheviks, got out on a British warship from Odessa, ended up in London, became professor of education, and he studied the history of Freemasonry in great detail. He tried to find the details of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, went to Paris, but of course when the Nazis invaded Paris, they burned and captured the lodge. And they destroyed the archives, took them back to Berlin. Because you may or may not know that whenever the Nazis conquered a city, they always rounded up the Freemasons and stuck them in prison. So what Nicholas Hans had to do was go to Philadelphia, because Thomas Jefferson was also a member of this lodge, a corresponding member, and he had all the backup archives. Thomas Jefferson was an extremely, intelligent example of what I'm talking about, enlightened, thinking. And so that's why he was able to write this book, UNESCO, the 18th century. So I think if you go into the history of Freemasonry, you'll discover that far from being a sort of satanic conspiracy, the conspiracy at its heart is actually an advancement of knowledge. One of the people that the Freemasons also look back on as one of their founders is Francis Bacon, philosopher of the Jacobean and Elizabethan period. And Bacon wrote a book called The Advancement of Learning, which you may or may not have come across. He dedicated to King James. And his argument, why he kick-started the philosophy of science, was that hitherto knowledge had been working with the wrong method. We'd been taking it from the schoolmen, from their translations of Aristotle and their sort of readings of the Bible, rather than evidence. So he said, let's invent this thing called scientific method. Let's have hypotheses, we test them, and we see if the theory works. And Bacon, in The Advancement of Learning, more or less single-handedly kick-started the philosophy of science. And so the metaphor of being a Freemason, which was something he was involved in at the beginning with King James, this is the 17th century. He worked at a place called Canonbury Tower in Islington, near where I used to live. Yeah, I'm talking about the rebirth of he was a good PR man who got his name attached. Obviously other people were doing it. In Oxford, Bacon and Roger Bacon was doing it. And in Italy, Italian thinkers, it was a general thought movement. But I think Bacon was the main chap in Britain doing it at the time.
The French and the English, are they interconnected in Masonry?
That's a very interesting question, and a sort of technical question in the history of Masonry. I refer you to the museum in Great Queen Street. They have a library that you can gain access to. Basically, the British lodges, you have to take an oath of belief in a supreme being, God. The French Grand Orient abolished that in the course of the late 19th century. They wanted atheists or humanists to be able to become Masons. So you don't have to take that oath in the French circle of the Grand Orient. It's complex.
In every part. In Theosophy, in Bahaism, in Sufism.
It must be one. There's various explanations for that. Either they're an evil, dastardly, satanic group, and Satan's running the whole show, or Ptah, who's the great architect of the universe and created it according to Egyptian theology, and also has his equivalent in India. There's a Hindu great architect who I've just been talking to Indian architects. They still have a place for him in Hindu theology. I think this notion of great architect is a very ancient religious notion. It's where this particular thing called Freemasonry comes from, and my position is I'm neither for nor against it. I'm simply an academic looking at it.
Who is this architect? Andrew
Yeah.
the Grand Master. His book was given to every initiate Mason.
Who's this? Sorry, who was that?
At the time, this is statue.
Oh yes, I know about his work. Yeah.
And famously in his book Reason and Dogma, he praises Lucifer.
Well, that was the point I was making earlier.
This is unknown.
Yeah. Sure. No, thank you for that.
Movements like
Yeah.
Theosophy or Steiner, who had Lucifer publication,
Right.
all praise Lucifer, but because they're outgrowths of Freemasonry.
Well, as I explained earlier, if you listen to the talk so far, I'm saving the exciting bits for the end, by the way, is that Freemasonry regards the devil or the Lucifer figure as an initiatory test to mankind. Doesn't believe in the totally literalist view.
Even the main God.
Hang on. Save it till the end. Okay, we're going to come back to that.
Thank you very much.
You should read about Goethe's life and also some of the other great philosophers. Hang on, Paul. Just suspend. Thank you.
Yes.
So going back, I want to stick with this thing about Marx for the moment, because what he was doing was he was part of this underground movement in European society, right? In the late 18th, early 19th century, which, Marx said famously that Prometheus is the patron saint of philosophers. And when I was growing up, I could appreciate that, because what he was saying by that is Prometheus brings knowledge, the torch of knowledge to mankind, teaches us, and actually, according to Greek mythology, Prometheus molds us from clay, is our actual creator, and Athena breathes the Holy Spirit into us. Right. Now Prometheus, who rebels against Zeus because he's afraid, he doesn't really like mankind, Zeus. He's not totally on our side. It's Prometheus that gives us fire, that gives us reason. And so therefore Prometheus is punished by Zeus for helping us. So Marx saw himself as a new Prometheus. He saw himself as a philosopher trying to bring reason and understanding to mankind. Now that's a Promethean job. And in the sense, you see, I think that the Lucifer myth in the Old Testament and the Lucifer stories in the rabbinic stories of Talmud and so on, I think they go back to a common Bronze Age origin. If you read Robert Graves' studies of the Greek myths and his work with Raphael Patai, when he went into the Hebrew myths, looking at the Bible, I think if you do archaeology and you go back to Bronze Age civilization, early Greek and Mycenaean culture was much more intermingled with early Phoenician and early Hebrew culture than people realize. And I think they were sharing myths and legends. And I think the Lucifer story, the Greeks call it the Prometheus story, the Semitic peoples called it the Satan story. But it's ultimately the same story about a spiritual being that tries to help mankind by bringing knowledge. And I think Marx definitely was part of, not alone, there was a whole movement who took that as their motif, their guiding myth, if you want.
And Shelley, the main God involved in that case, the main God.
Save it for a question. I'm going to deal with that, in a minute. Okay. I want to go on and make the very important point that Shelley, whose name has come up previously, was sent down from Oxford for atheism, but he wasn't an atheist. He was a deeply spiritual man who believed in human enlightenment, and he wrote his great masterpieces called Prometheus Unbound. And if you haven't read it, I once saw it performed at the Anthroposophical headquarters. There's a great anthroposophical scholar called Andrew Welburn, who's an expert on Shelley and has gone into his Gnostic and mystical understanding. So that world. Now, what you need to know about Marx is his first thing he wanted to be was a poet. Marx wanted to be a romantic poet like Byron, who he loved, and Shelley. He thought he'd change the world through literature and poetry. If you don't know this book, Karl Marx and World Literature, by Professor Proer from the University of Oxford, Germanic Studies, it's a masterpiece. Marx was the most learned literary scholar of his generation. He got it from his father, who was a great expert on French literature, and his future father-in-law, Jenny von Westphalen's father, who was an expert on Homer and Shakespeare. And Marx mastered classical literature. He read fluently Greek and Latin. He mastered Germanic studies, German literature, Schiller, Goethe, the whole lot. English literature, he could recite Shakespeare constantly. And if you read his writings, you know, he was really a literary scholar who wanted to save the world through romantic poetry and learning. I'd put that remark down almost as a heckle, Shaheen. We'll come back to that in a minute.
I ignore that remark.
Yeah. Also, there's another image which I love, I'd just like to share with you. When Marx was starting out as a journalist, because he couldn't make a living as a writer, right? You can't make a living as a poet, so he had to turn to journalism. And what he said was that he was like Diogenes. Now, Diogenes used to go around in Greece with a lamp, a light, in the daytime, saying he was looking for an honest man. This is a legend that's come down, Diogenes the philosopher. And Marx identified with that. He said, ignorance is a demon which will, we fear, be responsible for many a tragedy yet. This is Marx. The greatest Greek dramatists were right when they depicted it in the terrible dramas that deal with the royal families of Mycenae and Thebes as tragic fate. So basically, he was declaring war, as he saw it, on the demon of ignorance and trying to bring knowledge. And he said as a journalist he was going to go around Germany with a lamp in the daylight and ask, is there an honest man in this country? And of course the establishment didn't like it. But one could say the same thing even in contemporary Britain, you know, in certain circles. So what I would argue is that Marx was a Promethean, not a Satanist. And that, you know, if knowledge is evil, if striving for equality and ontological equality is evil, you know, and a satanic project, then yes, Marx would put his hand up and say, yes, I'm with Satan. But I would say, no, if you understand the background of 19th century romantic occultism, which led eventually at the end of the 19th century to things like the Golden Dawn, and these innovative occultist groups, and things like Theosophy and so on, they were trying to get to the truth. The motto of the Theosophical Society was, no religion is higher than truth. Marx, in his own way, was trying to get to truth. Now, I would say that also what they were trying to do was, I think in my book I argue that Marx was inspired by the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mystical tradition. Now, one of the greatest Kabbalists was a man called Isaac Luria, who talks about evil being caused by the separation of this world from the divine world. And the job of the Kabbalist or the mystic is to repair them, tikkun. We have to heal the split. And the only way we can really do that is through prayer and meditation and goodness, right? And Baal Shem Tov and all these Hasidic masters were inspired by Isaac Luria. Now, in Marx's theory of the end of alienation and the role of capital in destroying human relationships and values, if there's a Satan in Marx's theory, it's capital, because capital alienates people one from another. All we care about is how much money we can screw from each other. We don't care about each other's souls anymore. Marx's critique of capitalism was essentially inspired by that Kabbalistic desire for tikkun, or restoration. And in his vision of a class of society, the most marginalized, the most oppressed, the most poor, find a place back at the table with the King of the universe. Now that motif is in Christ's work. He's always inviting the poor and the homeless into the feast, right? And in that sense, I think Marx was actually being quite Christian in his radical notion, which is why there's a whole tradition of Christian Marxism.
On a German program made by the BBC, the first thing he said about Marx, he was a drunkard and a gambler. And
he had his off nights. I mean, yeah.
Objection.
Yeah, objection. Another heckle. Yeah, sure. No, absolutely outrageous. But he
Objection.
He did have, obviously. Look, I'm not here to whitewash Marx, and that's a very important point to bring up. If you have any idealistic sort of, the thing is, Marx's ideas were great. This romantic occultism, but how they actually worked out in practice when they got into the wrong hands is a whole other story. And, in Stalin's hands and Mao and so on. If you don't know a book called The Black Book of Communism by a bunch of scholars internationally, it documents nation by nation what happened when the Marxists and the communists actually got into power in reality. Basically, don't put romantic occultists in charge of the economy. Marx was, I think, the only fraud that Marx did was he tried to pretend he wasn't a romantic occultist and pretended he was a German academic professor of economics. And he spent years trying to justify his theories through appeal to economic science. But actually, the whole story was a bogus attempt. That's the fraud. Because romantic communist ideology is not a science, it's a utopian fantasy. I personally think it should be great. If you want to go off and live in a commune and live in a communistic way, there should always be people doing that on the planet. There always has been. What you shouldn't do is force it on other people. So, unfortunately, you went out at the crucial point there when I was explaining what happened to Marxism when it got into practice.
The condition of start of this meeting, didn't you raise the point that we can
save the questions for the end? I did actually say that.
You did.
But maybe I should have had it written up on the board here. I apologise.
Thank you very much. Forgive us.
Thank you. I'll work on it. Okay, so right. I want to bring the thing to a bit of a close. I've got about 3 more points I want to make. Okay, firstly, there is human evil, and I've just explained what happened when Marxism got into power. You get this over-concentration of power in the hands of people like Stalin, you get this over-centralization of power, and unbelievable horrors go on. But it also happens in theocracies. It seems to be was well said, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts totally. So, what can we do about that? What's the antidote to this ability to human beings to create tragedy out of what seems like originally a good idea? I mean, all the religions have had times when they've oppressed other peoples. Nobody, I think, doesn't have blood on their hands. Perhaps only the Jains, I don't think, have ever done torture of other people. Even the Buddhists have on occasion fallen to that, and they're doing persecution of Muslims now in parts of Malaysia and so on, and Burma. So one thing I want to just also flag up as part of a comparative diabology is the antidote to it all. Let's suspend judgment on whether there's a real devil, what that devil's like, and let's just say, well, what works in opposition to it? What's the counterforce? And I would say, well, there is a counterforce. And the one thing that seems to work with demonic phenomena is prayer. If you bring in an exorcist or you bring in someone, to counter this, mainly what they'll do is prayer. And I think very interesting studies on the scientific efficacy of prayer have been done. If you are dying of cancer and you do tests, the people that are prayed for tend to recover more. Nobody quite knows how it works, but prayer seems to be like an energy that can be sent from human beings to human beings. And there seems to be... We're doing questions at the end. Could you write it down, please, sir? And I'll come back to you. So we need a phenomenology of prayer and a transpersonal study of how it works. I think we need to free up prayer on the planet, because with the insistence of particular religions that we have to do prayer in this way or that way, and I won't pray with you because you're in a different religion, with all due respect, I think that's actually helping the diabolic, forces of history, because it's splitting mankind into these different religions. I would say that the true power of spirit transcends religious divisions. I was just last night at my talk in Oxford. There was a Sikh gentleman who identifies as a Christian. I think this is great, this kind of interfaith frontiersmanship. So I would say we need to study prayer in all the different religions, because that seems to work. How? Well, I think prayer is about... The word is connected to the word prana and prajna in Sanskrit. It means contacting your higher overself. And it's about integration. The diabolic seems to be about splitting and breaking things apart. We talk about the word schizophrenia when people literally feel they're broken apart, right? Or they hear voices from other dimensions and realms. Prayer integrates the psyche and meditation has the same effect. It's a different form of the same energy. What you do when you go into deep meditation states is you attain what's called samadhi, which etymologically means integrating into a state of saneness. All the fractured thoughts that we carry around in our mind. So if you practice advanced meditation, you can enter a place of clarity and deep peace. And in the Buddhist stories, when Mara, who's the devil in Buddhism, when Mara tries to tempt Buddha on the night of his enlightenment, Buddha's reached such a deep state of tranquil meditation and bliss that Mara's demons turn into flowers. The arrows he fires, fiery arrows, become flowers. So I believe it is possible. I think we would conquer the diabolic energies on this planet if we could all learn to cultivate these advanced states of transpersonal insight and meditation. And I think it should be taught in schools. The Set of Ari I've always started with quiet meditations, and I've done classes on the different types of prayer. You can have spoken, silent, wordless. They're all powerful, and they should all be used in different ways. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I just want to, on a historical note, in case you're interested, my own involvement, why I got interested in the study of this, was partly being brought up in a family. My mother was a Marxist, and I used to have long arguments and discussions with her when I wanted to become a romantic poet, and she was telling me, no, Marx is the truth. So my grappling with this goes right back to very early on, and my desire to become a philosopher was to kind of out-Marx Marx. So I spent years studying comparative philosophy. I spent years reading in the old British Museum reading room where he studied, in order to see what was the flaw with his theory and how we could improve on his ideas. Okay, and that led to my doctoral thesis at the University of London on transpersonal history. You see, I think Marx's theories of historical evolution and change are interesting and have some validity, but where they're false is they leave out the spiritual bit. I think Hegel was actually a greater thinker than Marx. And if anyone wants to do a PhD with me, I'd love to get somebody to read the whole works of Marx in order to find out how much actual Hegel he'd read. Because what Marx is always saying is, Hegel was great, but I'm greater. I've turned Hegel on his head. I know stuff he didn't. But actually, how much Hegel had Marx actually read? That would be a great PhD. If you ever come across anyone who's got that chapter and verse, let me know. Because I think he hadn't read very much, or he would have realised and been a bit more humble that Hegel was actually an amazing thinker, and that most of what Marx was doing, Hegel had already done, and a lot more. Right. Anyway, then it came about that when I was working here at the university, during the latter phases of the Cold War, I launched a group called Philosophers and Historians for Peace. And I got an invite to Moscow to a World Congress on the Philosophy of Peace. And I went and met these real Marxist philosophers in Moscow at the Institute of Philosophy. And this was the year when 1990, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. And I was meeting these really leading Soviet intellectuals who were profoundly learned in Marxism. But they were also very interested in spiritual philosophy and metaphysics and dialectics and esoteric Christianity and all kinds of things. I found them very warm-hearted, open-minded, profound geniuses. Russian philosophers are, in the 1990s were absolutely unbelievable intellectuals. And I met one in particular called Professor Chumakov, who I then met subsequently at the World Congress of Philosophy in Moscow in 1993, and who's the vice president of the Russian Philosophical Society. And I keep bumping into him. In Athens, I was at the World Congress of Philosophy in 2013, and also just now in India, I've been at a conference. So what the Russian intellectuals have done is they've outgrown their vulgar Marxism. They've honoured, the vision of Marxism working for an egalitarian, enlightened society. And they're trying to rethink how modern Russia can play a more peaceful role in the world. The problem is, and this is very interesting, is that the fighting going on in the Ukraine, it feels like we're going back into a Cold War scenario. Because now Russia's being demonized. They're no longer Marxists. We can't accuse them of being horrible Bolsheviks, but they're just Russians. We hate them. So, people are saying, well, we've got nuclear weapons. Let's have a nuclear war. This, my dear friends, is would be the final victory of the diabolic conspiracy of history, if there is one. And I'm international coordinator of Philosophers of Peace, right? Just meeting friends in India, Russian philosophers, American. What we're trying to do is, through this kind of critical analysis, like I've been doing tonight, of unthinking how we got into this mess, really. What I want to do is engage with Islamic theologians and thinkers. I want to talk to Wahhabis. I'd love to go and do this class in Mecca or Medina, if they'll have me, and guarantee my security. We have to have a very deep inter-theological discussion for peace. And, I would love to talk to people that literally believe in the devil. And, because what happened with the end of World War II, after the Nazis were defeated, their ideas transmigrated to the Middle East. And there's a very important book called The Genealogy of Evil by David Patterson, who talks about the origin of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the origin of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, ultimately. Now, this book by David Patterson, Cambridge University Press, The Genealogy of Evil, shows how the early Muslim Brotherhood actually read all the Nazi propaganda, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and they believed in it lock, stock and barrel. They translated it into Arabic, and that's been circulating on the underground in the Muslim Middle East ever since, which fits in with their anti-Zionism, because unfortunately Israel appeared after the Holocaust, and they just don't like it. And so, therefore, the way to explain it, instead of showing compassion, look, these Jews were nearly slaughtered, it's a bit of land, okay, we'll share it. No, because they're the children of Satan, because they've all been studying this ex-Nazi propaganda. So we have a serious situation on our hands on the planet, especially now we've got nuclear weapons. But I think my antidote is education and scholarship, and I'm prepared to talk because, these are very clever people. I've got many friends in Palestine and Israel and in the Middle East. I'm chair of a thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. My offering, as simply as a philosopher, I'm not a politician, is that we should begin to talk truth to each other. And that means going into the depths of our cultural backgrounds. So that's a background. My conclusion then is that we need to develop a peace policy. My proposal for a comparative diabology, to look at these kind of these myths and canards like Marx was a Satanist and so on. And by the way, in my talk last night at Oxford, I also asked the question of if we're going to ask was Marx a Satanist, we can also ask was Moses a Satanist. I dealt with that. And was Christ a Satanist secretly? I talked about this last night in Oxford. Yes. And also, was Muhammad a Satanist? I also asked that. And it's a very interesting we can ask these kind of questions. I would say that all people are tempted by the abuse of power. And there are instances in Moses' life and Muhammad's life and so on, probably even Jesus' life, when they lost the plot a bit. Can we have it as a question, Shane? I'm really at the end now. Just hold your horses. So what I'm saying is we need a peace policy. And instead, as I've said, instead of accusing the other guy of being the Satanist, what we should do is sit down and study this, develop a comparative diabology, and try and all work together to defeat, if there is a real devil out there, we should try and defeat him. We need a proper common strategy. It seems to me the very worst thing we can be doing is breaking up into little tribes, accusing the other guys of being with the devil. Human beings should all get together, study comparative diabology, share their esoteric teachings with one another, and then actually go for the real devil, who's probably some kind of alien, off-world. I don't know. Okay. So then we can do a transpersonal reconciliation of the different tribes. I don't personally want to stick around whilst the world's being blown up by literalists and jihadists who, are sort of fighting literally because they believe the other guys were the devil. So, and then I've got another final question to ask. If there is a real devil, he's like in the textbooks and he was there in the Garden of Eden, would he actually want the planet to be blown up? I actually don't think he would, because what's the devil? He's the life force. He's the green man in the woods. He likes life. He likes sexuality. He likes women, and he likes eros and pleasure and the wildness of life. I don't think even the devil is for the total annihilation of the planet. In my view, the devil is more like Dionysus or Shiva, and is therefore on this kind of investment in organic being. if you want a green warrior angel. So another question we should ask, would God actually therefore want the world to be blown up? Just to spoil the devil's party, Well, I don't think so. The God that I've read about seems to be the God of love and compassion in all the religions. So I don't think actually even God wants the whole planet to be destroyed. He can surely think of a better way of getting the nasty evil people. Because some literalists believe that God is going to come and destroy the entire world, transport a few saved people to a rapture, and everyone else will be a smoking ruin. Now, I think that's a ridiculous theology and very oversimplistic. And I would say God can surely be more creative than that. He can sort of beam up the evil ones. I don't know. And therefore, if neither the devil nor God want to blow up the world, then the only solution is they sit down together and come up with a common peace policy, which goes back to Goodwin Barmby and Blake and everyone. We have to declare a comparative biological peace, if you want. And then, one of the projects I've developed is called the Golden Gate Project. I'll just finish with this if you've not heard about that. The legend says that at the Last Judgment, there's a gate in the eastern wall of the old city of Jerusalem which is locked, and it has been by the Ottoman Sultan's order since the 16th century. And the legend is that at the end of time, that gate will open, and the Messiah will come, open the gate, walk in, and judge the world, and then there'll be peace. And not until does that happen will we get peace on the planet. It's a logjam, right? So what I've said, I've been all around the planet, I've travelled in about 33 countries, met interfaith leaders from every religion. What I've proposed is a radical idea. It's kind of Krishnamurti take on the Messiah. If the Messiah, the Seishant, to use the Zoroastrian word, is embedded in all of us in some way, then we collectively, and all the religious leaders of the planet, should collectively reopen this Golden Gate in a big symbolic, happening. Could be filmed on television, it would be BBC Newsnight, live from the Golden Gate, right? So what we do is we get permission from the Israeli authorities, from the Palestinian authorities, who run the Temple Mount. It's a peace project. We open the gate on a particular auspicious day, and then all the religious leaders of the world come in a procession, like that wonderful photograph when Martin Luther King was leading a march. There were about 12 abreast, right? They didn't want to go first. So you have your Catholic, your Sunni, your Shia, your Jewish Orthodox, Jewish Progressive. The Druid can come right at the end. That's fine, because you have a little procession thing. And that, to me, is calling the bluff of the devil. It's saying, actually, we can do this. We can heal our religious splits. And we can fast forward to the happy ending of history. We have that power. And that, I think, is also what Marx was trying to do. He was saying, instead of playing out these religious superstitions, we should fast forward to enlightenment and the realization of that state that religions point towards. So anyway, there we are. I'm going to conclude there. And now, time for questions. I know